One of the more common questions I get are what are these notwithstanding clauses in California legislation? And actually, this phrase is commonly used in both federal and state legislation. So, from time to time, you see in California bills, for example, a bill that contains in the text of the measure, notwithstanding any other provision of law, blah, 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 or something similar to that effect. What exactly does this phrase mean and what's its impact? And why would it have to be used in a bill? Of course, this phrase is also used in contracts and other legal documents. But here we discuss it in the context of state legislation. So, what form does this phrase take in California legislation? Things like notwithstanding any other law, notwithstanding any other provision of law, notwithstanding any contrary provision, notwithstanding any other state law, notwithstanding a particular section, etc. What's the purpose? The general definition of a notwithstanding clause is in spite of the fact that something else is here. So in other words, basically the notwithstanding phrase is used to effectively communicate that, hey, in spite of any other law or laws that may be contrary or may be found somewhere else in other statutes, this particular section of law, it takes precedent over those other provisions. In other words, the phrase notwithstanding any other law is legal language or contractual language that states what follows this introductory clause supersedes any other law that might contradict it. Now, as you might expect, this phrase sometimes raises legal questions, whether it really means that no other provisions of law apply. As I mentioned at the outset, that this phrase is commonly used in both federal and state legislation. So its use is not particularly unique to California. In fact, hundreds of bills in the US Congress and the California legislature in every 2-year session, again, utilize this type of a phrase. But how do the courts interpret this provision? Well, to be fair, federal and state courts sometimes accept it and sometimes they don't, what you might expect. It really depends on the context in which the phrase is used. So some courts have interpreted this phrase narrowly to only apply to conflicting laws, while other courts have interpreted the phrase more broadly to supersede any other law that's out there. So like other matters of statutory interpretation, the courts may look to the surrounding statutes and the intent of the legislative body. The US Supreme Court in the case of Cisneros versus Alpine Ridge Group, which was decided by the High Court in 1993, they stated the use of a notwithstanding clause signals the drafter's intention that the provisions of the notwithstanding section override conflicting provisions of any other section. Now, why is this phrase used? Well, bill drafters could either use this broad phrase, like the examples I identified earlier, or they could reference a specific code section or perhaps multiple code sections. The specific section reference, again, would supersede other specific code sections. But with the broader use of the phrase, it might be used for several other reasons. For example, there may be just too many other code section references to actually specify, or it may be too difficult or even time consuming for the bill drafter to list every reference. So this broad all-encompassing language is then utilized. A bill drafter might also not want to miss any potential conflicting or provisions that might be implicated from existing law. And so the broad phrase is used to hopefully ensure that they capture any other potential provisions of law that might be, applicable here. At the same time, bill drafters, I think, also need to be careful that use of the broad phrase doesn't maybe inadvertently exclude the application of some other statute that, in fact, should apply in a particular circumstance. As such, when drafting statutes that contain a notwithstanding any other section of law or some sort of similar language, bill drafters need to be careful that such a broad outcome is expected and desired in those cases.